Hi, I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to LOA Live. Library of America is a nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the multivocal, democratic spirit of our literary tradition a vital part of the culture. Warm thanks to Library of America members and to all of you attending tonight for supporting our work and these LOA Live programs. Special thanks to our promotional partner for this program, the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers. Grief, Joan Didion wrote, turns out to be a place none of us know until we reach it. In two luminous memoirs, The Year of Magical Thinking and Blue Nights, she relates the deaths of her husband and her daughter with stunning precision, poignancy, and power, a late demonstration of her genius that won her a new generation of readers. Both memoirs are collected along with other later writings, in this new volume from Library of America, the capstone third volume of the Library of America Joan Didion edition, edited by David Ulin, and to be published this coming Tuesday, available singly or as a boxed 3-volume set. And our producers will drop a link for more information about the books in the chat. How do we make sense of loss? Deal with the sudden, overwhelming presence of absence? How does a person unmoored and crazed by grief? Didion observes her own mind's refusal to accept the reality of her husband's death. Find a way to tell herself stories in order to live. What does it mean to share publicly in writing such a profoundly private experience? And how does it speak to us as readers? And how might Didion's telling help us understand and reckon with our own great losses? Joining us to explore these and other questions are two acclaimed writers and committed readers of Didion who have reckoned with grief in their own work. Honor Moore is an award-winning poet, playwright, and memoirist whose books include The Bishop's Daughter, a New York Times Editor's Choice, and most recently, A Termination, a memoir of an abortion. For Library of America, she edited selected poems of Amy Lowell and poems from the women's movement, and co-edited Women's Liberation, feminist writings that inspired a revolution and still can. She joins us from New York City, where she teaches at the New School's MFA program. David Ulin, editor of the LOA Didion edition, is an award-winning essayist and poet. Books editor for Alta and former book editor of the Los Angeles Times. His works include The Lost Art of Reading, Books and Resistance in a Troubled Time, and most recently, the novel 13-Question Method. For Library of America, he has also edited Writing Los Angeles, a literary anthology. He joins us from his home in Los Angeles. Megan O'Rourke, who had hoped to join us this evening, had to bow out due to illness. So we send her our best wishes for speedy recovery. We invite your questions and comments. The Q&A button is on your menu bar. If you have a question or comment, we invite you to share your name and where you're viewing from. And now, please welcome our friends, Honor Moore and David Ulin. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Max. Hope everybody can hear me okay. And thanks to the incredibly large number of people who are participants in this Zoom. I'm not going to look at that number, so I won't be intimidated. And Honor, welcome. I'm so delighted that we're going to have this conversation together.
Yeah.
I just want to, a couple things. Honor and I'll talk for about 35 minutes or so, and then we will turn it over to questions from all of you. There is a Q&A box on the bottom of the Zoom screen. You can click on that and post your questions there. That's probably the most effective place to put it, and then we'll get to as many of those questions as we can at the end. I'm particularly interested in this these works, the works in this third volume, for a number of reasons, because they signal a couple of, I think, significant shifts in Didion's work, but they also signal a kind of continuity. We had been talking before the panel started about how grief was something that has marked her work throughout. And we've also talked a little bit, both of us have some experience in terms of this kind of excavation with personal work, about the sort of requirements of writing about grief. So Honor, why don't we start maybe a little bit with kind of Didion's sensibility and how it sort of is both consistent with these later works, but how these later works with their intense focus on her own experience and particularly her own experience of grief kind of push it into I don't want to say a different direction, but maybe a more concrete direction. Grief was more of an abstraction to her when she was a younger writer in the earlier works. Now we're reading her kind of facing it full on.
Well, I would like to also introduce the word loss, the idea of loss right next to grief, because so much of the California writing has to do with the loss of a California that she is from, that she writes about and where I was from. But I was struck, I had this intuition rereading these two memoirs that I remember reading Slouching Toward Bethlehem when it came out, and I was a very young writer or even would-be writer. And it was like, oh my God, who is this person with this incredibly vivid voice? And then to read these books from sort of the end of her life, there's a way in which she's way more interested in her own absence than her own presence. There's a way in which she sort of she's kind of hiding, wishing to hide from, I guess, what she's feeling and what she might say. And I think that's so very, it's very typical of writing in bereavement, because suddenly you have this entirely new experience and you don't know where you are. It truly is a place that none of us knows, and it truly is a place, or I prefer to say dimension, that none of us knows. And so you feel the shock, of her writing it. And I wanted to should I read this little part?
Sure, yeah, please.
There's a moment, she doesn't really write out of her body terribly much, but in this she sort of does. People who have recently lost someone have a certain look, recognizable maybe only to those who have seen that look on their own faces. I have noticed it on my face, and I notice it now on others. The look is one of extreme vulnerability, nakedness, openness. It is the look of someone who walks from the ophthalmologist's office into the bright daylight with dilated eyes, or of someone who wears glasses and is suddenly made to take them off. These people who have lost someone look naked because they think themselves invisible. I myself felt invisible for a period of time, incorporeal. I seemed to have crossed one of those legendary rivers that divide the living from the dead, enter a place in which I could be seen only by those who were themselves recently bereaved. I understood for the first time the power in the image of the rivers, the Styx, the Lethe, the cloaked ferryman with his pole. I understood for the first time the meaning of the practice of sati. Widows did not throw themselves on the burning raft of grief. The burning raft was instead an accurate representation of the place to which their grief, not their families, not the community, not custom, their grief had taken them. On the night John died, we were 31 days short of our 40th anniversary. You will have by now divined that the hard, sweet wisdom in the last two lines of Rose Almer, a poem she had quoted earlier, was lost on me. I wanted more than a night of memories and sighs. I wanted to scream. I wanted him back.
Yeah.
And that feels so un-Didion anyway.
No, it does. Well, it's you're absolutely right, because Didion, there's only in the earlier work, as I recall, there's only one moment where we see the facade crack and we see her vulnerability, and that's in the essay Slouching Towards Bethlehem, when she witnesses the 5-year-old kid on acid, and she doesn't have any words for it. It's the only time I've ever read her where she doesn't have any words until she gets here. But I'm wondering if what occurred to me as you were reading that passage is, there's that kind of grief or loss, like that sudden loss, right? I mean, her husband,
Mhm.
John Gregory Dunn, they were sitting down to dinner. She brought him a second drink. He had a massive coronary and died. It's a different kind of loss, I think, than a kind of lingering loss, which is more the experience she has with her daughter Quintana, which is traced in both of these two
Right.
memoirs. Or for that matter, with her parents and her mother in particular, whose death and that aftermath is described in part in Where I Was From. So I'm curious about your thoughts on the two different kind of, are they different kinds of loss or different kind of grieving, do you think?
Well, I do think that. I mean, the sudden thing is, I mean, when my mother died, there were 6 months.
Right.
The doctor said you have 6 months to live, and it turned out it was exactly 6 months. So one, and I was in my 20s, so it was all like a brave new world. I mean, not brave, a horrifying new world, but there was one could prepare. Um, I've had more recent deaths where it's just one day the person's alive, the next day they're not. And that's really way more disorienting because it's like, where do they go? Somehow, the lingering mourning, illness thing, we know where the person is going. We might be in denial and say, oh, if she drinks vegetable juice for 89 days, she's going to come back. But, no, and you go through your denial and this and that. But with the one day that they're there and one day they're not, it's very disconcerting. Don't you think? I
Yeah.
mean,
No, I absolutely. I mean, my mother died recently, earlier this fall, and after a long period of illness, it was not a surprise at all. We knew it was coming. Um, we knew it was still disorienting, even in that shift from the infirm person that we had been taking care of to the non-existence of that person, or
yes,
the non-existence, the non-presence of that person. And it's been interesting for me as a writer because I've gone back. I hadn't written a lot of poetry in the last several years, but I've gone back to writing poetry because it seems, both during her illness and in the aftermath, because it seems that the only form that can kind of capture the immediacy of the moment, because I have no conclusions. One of the things that I find striking, particularly about the first 90 or 100 pages of Magical Thinking, which I think is some of the finest pages in her body of work, is that it captures that in the moment quality.
yes,
There's a quality in those pages of, I don't want to say non-acceptance, but disbelief almost, and it's just to
yes,
keep going over material like the passage that I had selected from that book, which I'll just share quickly because I think it ties into this. It follows up on yours, and it is from the very beginning of Magical Thinking. She starts a passage. This is right after she's kind of given us the news, and after the first line break, she writes, in outline, "It is now, as I begin to write this, the afternoon of October 4th, 2004. 9 months and 5 days ago, at approximately 9 o'clock on the evening of December 30th, 2003, my husband, John Gregory Dunn, appeared to, or did, experience at the table where he and I had just sat down to dinner in the living room of our apartment in New York, a sudden, massive coronary event that caused his death. Our only child, Quintana, had been for the previous 5 nights unconscious in an intensive care unit at Beth Israel Medical Center's Singer Division, at that time a hospital on East End Avenue. It closed in August 2004, more commonly known as Beth Israel North, or the Old Doctors Hospital, where what had seemed a case of December flu sufficiently severe to take her to an emergency room on Christmas morning had exploded into pneumonia and septic shock. This is my attempt to make sense of the period that followed, weeks and then months that cut loose any fixed idea I had ever had about death, about illness, about probability and luck, about good fortune and bad, about marriage and children and memory, about grief, about the way in which people do and do not deal with the fact that life ends, about the shallowness of sanity, about life itself." I think that's a remarkable passage, both because
yeah.
of, I mean, she goes so far, but it's almost as if she's using those specifics, those dates, those addresses, what the hospital used to be called. They're all kind of things she's trying to she's trying to use to keep herself in the physical world in some way.
Situate herself. You
Exactly,
know,
situate
yeah,
herself. Yeah.
yeah, and she does that. I think that's where she comes to memoir out of journalism, and I think that's, that's a device she uses. There's a lot of reporting in the memoirs, a lot of research, even quotes from books, a lot of things like the doctor's hospital closed, those kinds of details, which those are a journalist's details, or at least they're rendered that way.
Yeah.
And I'm just looking. I wrote down a bunch of things that I call one-liners, and this is sort of in contradiction to but it's also from this book. She quotes Robert Duvall, the actor, saying, "I exist very nicely between the words action and cut." And what you've just read is the action,
Yeah.
or the in between action and cut, and I think it's so interesting how she goes back and forth between wishing to embody and express the grief and not.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, you teach a class, the uses of literary seminar, the uses of memory, I'm sorry, the uses of
Memory, yeah.
memory, right? And so I'm curious if we can talk about that in regard to these books, this idea that, a memoir is not a life, it's a story that's pulled out of details or constructed or out of selected details of a life.
Right.
One of the things that strikes me particularly about Year of Magical Thinking is that it is so much a book in its own presence, in its own present tense, almost, that it feels kind of raw and unconstructed, even though I'm aware of the construction in the book. And yeah, in terms of both what you're teaching, but also your own experience as a memoirist, I wonder if we can talk a little bit about the shaping of the narrative of memoir, which to me is an essential aspect of the form.
Well, I see this. I mean, I imagine what she did, because I've just written a book that's a short memoir that's sort of done this way. I imagine she wrote the chunks randomly. And she wrote the passage I read, she wrote the passage you read, or maybe she writes the chronology, but maybe not all chronologically. And then she does things like stick in these sentences that she repeats. I'm just trying to find them. She has a quote from Sir Gawain in the Green Knight: "I tell you, I shall not live 2 days." And there are various other repetitions that she uses. And I imagine that she placed these chunks, that's what I call them, and then sort of looked to see what was needed to make the narrative coherent, which I imagine is what the passage you read came in a kind of second draft, whereas what I read perhaps came in a kind of more firsty, drafty thing. And then she, I think, strung those the repeated one-liners and various one-liners through it. And I think that its structure is very sort of unintellectual. I think it's very felt, which is interesting because she's always so often so this happened and then that happened, and break here and going back there, but it's not. This is poetic, really, in its structure, even though her language is not usually poetic. Her language is very prose, but the structure is poemish.
Yeah, no, I think the structure certainly, actually, in many ways of both books. I think that, one of the challenges for me with Blue Nights, and I talked to her about this when the book came out, was that I think she was, because her husband was her peer, and
Right.
was her collaborator and her colleague, as well as her,
Right.
her husband, her life partner, that she was able to approach his death, I don't want to say more clinically, but perhaps more ruthlessly. And
Yes.
whereas the illness and the death of Quintana, her daughter, I think is a much, for obvious reasons, is probably much more fraught than that. I mean, what is it? So my sense is that Blue Nights is an attempt to get at something that doesn't always work, because
Right.
the mother's grief I hate to say gets in the way. That's not what I mean, but the mother's grief becomes a kind of an insurmountable obstacle in a certain sense. She's still trying to protect her child, even though even though the book is about the death of the child.
Plus, mothers and daughters, I'm sorry, but there are a lot of mixed feelings and we don't get those. And oddly, uh, we uh, we don't get a sense of the daughter. I
Right.
mean, all you get is the hair, the long braid, and dresses that she wears, and a tattoo that shows through the one of the dresses at her wedding. We don't get a sense of the husband. We don't, the love feels kind of free, like it's floating. I mean, I don't mean it's insincere, but it feels as if she doesn't sort of know herself as a loving mother. It's as if the loss suddenly insists that she examine herself as a loving mother,
Right.
if that makes sense. Because it's like she's in or not La La Land, but some, you know, sort of strange place, a stranger in a strange land, kind of. And the tripping and falling, that she has that passage. Uh, I fear falling on the street. I imagine bicycle messengers knocking me to the ground. The approach of a child on a motorized scooter causes me to freeze mid intersection, play dead. I no longer go for breakfast to three guys on Madison Avenue. What if I were to fall on the way? And I think that's, even though this was an adopted daughter, it obviously, I think the grief is deeply physically shocking to her.
Yeah.
And that's an alien, and that her practice in life is not exactly acknowledging that kind of feeling, if that makes
Right. I think that's right. I mean, I do think of that passage in the author's note of Slouching Towards Bethlehem, where she talks about being, my main skill as a reporter is that I'm so small and physically unobtrusive that you forget that my presence in your living room is not in your best interests. It's
Right.
bad paraphrase. And I think, what you're saying, as I had once said to her, as a memoirist, is your presence in your own living room against your best interests? And she said,
Mhm.
yes, it is. So I think that's right. I mean, and I think that there is that kind of repertorial element, that idea that she is reporting on her own life, as well as she's both she's the recorder and the subject at the same time, which I guess all memoirists are. For me, one of the most interesting aspects of Blue Nights is, which ties into exactly what you were just talking about, is that sense of her own physical vulnerability, that sense of her own awareness for the first time of her own process of aging, in a certain sense. I mean,
Yes.
the book
Yes.
was written or published and she was in her mid 70s, I think, or yeah, about the mid late 70s when that book came out. So it's also fascinating to me that it's that moment after the death of her daughter that she becomes aware of her own kind of physical vulnerability.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm I'm interested. If this is too intense, forget, we can move on. But I was interested whether you found any identification with her sort of her stumbling around in your own very recent bereavement.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, she and I share that quality of, I think she calls it prickly dread in Some Dreamers of the Golden Dream. I was always someone who was, even as an adolescent, who thought, bad things don't always happen to other people. Sometimes they happen to you. And
Mhm.
so I always had that kind of awareness. So when I first read her, I had a similar experience. When I first came across her, I read Slouching Towards Bethlehem. In fact, my mother was the one who recommended that I read that book.
Mhm.
And there was something both about the style, which I had never seen before, but her willingness to kind of write out of her own kind of feeling of doom or dread or impending loss. It
Right.
almost feels like she was anticipating these losses, half a century before they happened in some way, or that, that's,
Well,
there's a way. Go ahead. Yeah.
not to mention other losses like 9/11, and you know, there it's not just personal doom. If
Right.
she has this sense that every, you know, the center kind of hold. I mean, she quotes that Yeats, and of course that had me immediately that she quoted that because it was such a feeling we had in 1968, and we have it now, you know, and it's as if she's prophetic. It's as if, and I always, maybe this is kind of corny, but I have the feeling because she's from California. You know, there's a sense of, I mean, a real California, a deep California, which, you know, is a different planet really than me. I grew up on the East Coast, you know, so it's, and there's a sense, you know, the Donner Party, the earthquakes, the, you know, and maybe it's her smallness, her physical smallness too, the sense of, you know, vulnerability, which she actually doesn't admit to quite. It's doom, it's the threat, it's something's around the corner that's gonna, you know, I will not live more than 2 years, you know, that,
Right.
yeah.
I think that's right. I mean, it's so interesting you say that because I agree. I mean, I think that, you know, there is that notion of California. I grew up in New York and I moved to
Mhm.
California in my late 20s and I've been here ever since. So I came to California with all of the New York sort of ideas of particularly Southern California. And then I got here and I realized, you know, within the first couple of years I was here, there were wildfires, there were massive floods, there were, you know, buildings sliding off hillsides, there were huge earthquakes, there was all, it was drought, there was all of it. I was like, I felt like I moved to, you know, I moved to the Old Testament or something like that,
Oh,
you know.
you did.
And I think she's always been in tune with that, but it's also temporal, you know, because if you think about Run River, which is a novel that I think is very underrated and which she recapitulates and critiques in Where I Was From.
Oh,
Uh, part of what, you know, the sort of the antagonist in Run River is a real estate developer who's buying up all the river, you know, the river properties, all the agricultural river properties and turning them into subdivisions. And again, it's not, I don't really believe in prescience, but she's paying attention. And that's
yes,
exactly what happened throughout California, starting in, I mean, that book takes place in 1959. By 1969, all those subdivisions were built and further subdivisions were being built. So she just kind of saw it. And so it's the always, I'm aware of the loss of an old way of life, whether that's the old way of life of, you know, of old Sacramento or the old way of life of a young and growing family, or the old way of life of
Hollywood,
or Hollywood, or all of it, right? So,
old Hollywood, yeah.
yeah, and
But I think she does believe in prescience.
she may, yeah. Well, can you talk a little bit about why you feel that way?
Well, I mean, it's, I just noticed it because I'm not like that. You know, I'm
Mhm.
an idiot. I'm a kind of optimistic idiot, and so I don't think of that. I don't think, you know, someone's behind me. I'm going to get clubbed. The work, you know, no, you know, it's like really, you know, everything that's happening right now politically. It's like really that's happening. I mean, people have predicted this. You know, I'm not sort of, I don't sort of look behind me. So I noticed it, you know, you know, throughout the texts. Let's see. Well, you know, just a line like, getting back to John, he had 25 nights left to live. You know,
Yeah.
writing a sentence like that, they're all the way through it. You know, it's as if, you know, it's like someone's deciding this. You know,
Mhm.
someone's got her number and the numbers are counting down, and
Right.
she doesn't know how the end is going to come, but it's going to come, and it's all through her work.
Yeah, you
It's a
only see the pattern.
climate.
Right, you only see the pattern in retrospect. Climate is exactly right. I think about it as inner weather,
Yes.
and that's it is. Like I'm very aware of the fact that, you know, sometimes people criticize her or critique her view of California as being too much about her own internal sensibility. Although, of course, what else do we have as writers? It's always about our
Right.
own internal sensibility. I
Right.
want to read a little passage from Where I Was From, which I think gets at this. And it's about Nancy Kennedy, who, as I recall, is Anthony Kennedy's or was Anthony Kennedy's sister.
Oh,
Nancy was my best friend from Sacramento, traveling with her parents. This is only a guess, but an informed one, since another letter to my mother that summer mentions having, quote, heard from Nancy, who was at the Greenbrier and so bored before beginning Stanford. Nancy and I had known each other since we were 5 when we had been in the same ballet class at Miss Marion Hall's dancing school in Sacramento. In fact, there was also in the box that came from my mother's house a program for a recital of that very ballet class. Joan Didion and Nancy Kennedy, the program reads, Les Petites. There were also in the box many photographs of Nancy and me modeling children's clothes in a charity fashion show, wearing matching corsages around our wrists at a high school dance, standing on the lawn outside Nancy's house on the day of her wedding, Nancy in bouffant white, the bridesmaids in pale green organza, all of us smiling. The last time I saw Nancy was at the Outrigger Canoe Club in Honolulu during the Christmas season of the Iran hostage crisis. I love that phrase so much.
Right.
She was at the next table having dinner with her husband and children. They were laughing and arguing and interrupting just as she and her brothers and her mother and father had laughed and argued and interrupted in the late 40s and early 1950s when I would have dinner at their house 2 or 3 times a week. We kissed, we had a drink together, we promised to keep in touch. A few months later, Nancy was dead of cancer at Lenox Hill Hospital in New York. I sent the recital program to Nancy's brother to send on to her daughter. I had my grandmother's watercolor framed and sent it to the next oldest of her 3 granddaughters. I closed the box and put it in the closet. There is no real way to deal with everything we lose. That, that last sentence there coming out of that in a book that is in some ways about loss, but not in the same direct way. And
Yeah.
also in some ways, it reminds me of the kind of, in that instance, it is someone, as with her husband, who just drops dead out of
Right,
cancer.
right.
But in that last moment, she's not aware that she's going to be dying that soon.
Well, and it's interesting, that passage, which I hadn't gotten to in the book. Um, Here I have a quote from Blue Nights. In fact, I no longer value this kind of memento.
Mhm.
So there she is again. I love that she lets herself contradict herself. That she,
Always.
yeah,
And I mean,
yeah,
where I was from in many ways is an entire book of contradictions because, as I said, she goes back and essentially deconstructs Run River and talks about all of the kind of the mythic California that she just took for granted, and then she takes it apart and really explores California as a kind of a welfare state in the sense of big government subsidies to farmers and all that kind of stuff. The
right,
vaunt of California independence is just another piece of fiction. But then when
right.
she turns it on her, turns it on her family, and she had said in interviews that she didn't write, she had to wait to write Where I Was From until her parents died because
Right.
she felt that she was betraying them in some way. And I wonder if we can talk a little bit about the sort of, whether in terms of the literature of grief or memoir or any kind of personal writing. I wrestle with this a lot, and I talk to students about this a lot. The question of betrayal or responsibilities to one's subject. I mean, you've had experience with this in your own writing, as well as in terms of reading Didion and thinking about her approach to these questions.
Well, I always tell my students that their job is to be responsible to their own memory, to be true to their own memory, and then fact check. I mean, I say if your memory tells you that the Twin Towers fell on September 13th, 2006, you've got a problem. You can't have, you can't have those kinds of mistakes. So there's that. And I've had some difficult experiences with people being offended or enraged by things I've put in books. And I myself feel that it's my story to the things are that I went through are my story to tell. And so there's that. But for instance, I I wrote a book about my mother, Our Revolution, and in that, and she had a sister, and a lot of the materials, my mother was a fabulous writer, and there are tons of letters and things that I used. And I discovered that the sister had not only been in a mental hospital, but had done 3 suicide attempts. Now, I thought that her kids didn't know about this. I'd never heard about it. And she herself said, I don't like to think about that. before she died. I don't like to think about that. So I called her oldest daughter, and I read her that. She knew none of it. And I thought, this is not my mother. This is not my story to tell. I need something in there about her mental, emotional complexity and difficulties and pain. But how can I make it okay for her children who've never heard of this? And what the oldest daughter and I decided is I would take out the suicide attempts, but leave the mental hospital and the context. So I think I think Didion feels this way too, is what the story needs. You sort of have to find a way to include what the story needs. And isn't it Tolstoy who said, if there's a writer in the family, there is no family, any longer, or something like that.
The family is, when a writer is, I think the quote is, when a writer is born into a family, the family is finished.
Right. Well, but I've sort of been compelled to take my life as a writer. It's like the main thing.
Mhm.
And Didion says that too. She says, I am a writer. I think that's one of the more it's a very attractive thing about her voice, is she's not she's not a woman who is confused, split between being a housewife and being a writer. I mean, she says, I want to be a good wife, but he's a writer too, and they read each other's work, so it's interesting. I don't know whether that answers your question, but
No, it's just an interesting, I'll tell you, years ago, in the early 90s, my mother had breast cancer, and I was living in California. She was living in New York, and I went into New York a few times and did chemo with her, went and accompanied her when she had chemo.
right.
And the first time I went, I kept storing stuff in my head until I couldn't keep it all in my head. And then I would excuse myself to go to the bathroom, and I'd write everything down, and then I'd come back and sit with her. And I thought I was being very subtle. And after the second or third time of doing this, she looked at me and said, "It's okay, you can just take notes." So I really respond to that idea that, I was in that room as a son, and I was trying to do service. But at the
Right.
same time, I was very aware that, I didn't know whether there was going to be a piece of writing to come out of it, but I knew if I didn't write the details down, I wasn't going to have them later when I might need them. And
Right.
so there's always, I think, for a writer, particularly a writer of personal material, that kind of tension. And like I said, I think, even in her journalistic work, she's very present. Even in a piece like, in a piece like The White Album, she has her psychiatric evaluation as part of that essay, even though
Right.
that essay isn't really a piece about her own breakdown, although it kind of is as well. So there's always that sense of, exposing herself, or, she said writers are always selling someone out. She's always kind of selling herself out in a certain sense, even when the piece is about something else.
Well, it's interesting, of course, the person who comes to mind when you talk about that aspect of Didion is Janet Malcolm,
Yeah.
who does not sell herself out, but she sells out other people, so that's an interesting thing I hadn't really thought of, that she isn't very, it's not a very, it's like you don't feel like you're going to have a good time at lunch with Joan Didion, at least the Joan Didion narrator. I mean, I'm sure one did, because she hung out with a lot of people who required people to be interesting and fun or whatever. But anyway,
It's funny, I don't know if you've ever read John Gregory Dunn's book Vegas, which is a kind of fictional
I
memoir.
haven't. I a what?
It's a fictional. It's framed as a memoir, but he admits that he makes a bunch of things up in it.
Oh,
And there's one part where he almost parodies her. He calls her to see how things are going, and he says something about, the Corvette, the famous Corvette, the Julian Wasser Corvette, is in the shop, and it kind of reminds me of that line from the essay on the migraine, where you have a fight with a phone company. Like, he goes through this litany, and someone's trying to set him up with a showgirl, and she says, "I think you should go and have the date." And he says, "I don't want to." And she responds, "Well, that's part of the story too." It's it's one of my favorite Joan Didion moments, and it's not even in a piece of writing of her own.
Oh, it's got to be true.
It's
Do you
got to be
think he
true, right?
totally made that up? No.
I don't think he made that scene up at all. I think some of the
Right,
others, but
right.
but there is, again, I think it's that sense, and that's something that interests me too about them as a couple. That so much of, as you were saying before, her identity as a writer is encoded into her identity as a, as a spouse, as a daughter, as a mother, as a friend, as a human.
Right.
And for him as well. And it's so much a part of their partnership in that sense, which both gets at the utter dislocation on so many levels of his death, but also
Yes.
it's almost like a shared kind of sense of ruthlessness. We can excavate our shared experiences together because we both know what's going on. We both
Right.
share language,
We're not betraying each other. Yeah. I mean, we
Exactly.
made a deal,
Yeah.
kind of.
Yeah.
But it's interesting you bring up the we, because I started noticing just today when I was going over things again, the we voice that comes in to, I mean, she uses it. Other people might use the word one,
Mhm.
but she says we, meaning humans. But I thought, for her to lose him, it's almost like she really was losing half of herself. I mean, because they seem, whatever complications, a marriage has, they were very joined at the hip.
Yeah. Yeah.
And even Quintana really was part of the we of them, less, I mean, at least I, I talked to someone today who had her as a student, and I was like, oh, that'd be interesting to explore that. But I don't get a sense of who she was. All I get is this we, and I just had this image of her splitting apart, and just sitting there, and that tiny woman, and suddenly this tree, half the tree splits off and falls down. It's really
Exactly. I think of that too. It feels like that's a great way of putting it. I think that half the tree splits apart. I can't imagine. I mean, they read each other's work, they edited each other's work, they collaborated on screenplays. She was his primary research assistant when he was doing the book about Cesar Chavez and
uh-huh.
the Ano. And so it feels like they're so enmeshed in each other, and as subjects too. I mean, they're constantly right in the islands, which begins like we're sitting in an island in lieu of getting a divorce. So there's
Right.
all that element of kind of shared exposure going on.
It's interesting to think about that, not only as kind of ordinary bereavement in the voice of the memoirs, but as a kind of, she doesn't have her part of her voice. I mean, it's like there's and Peter Sachs talks about, when he writes about the elegy, he talks about working through, but he also talks about the replacement in the writing and creating the character of the lost person, the dead person. And it's, you get that sense, the kind of disorientation and kind of physical pain of the splitting of the voice.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of that makes a lot of sense. And I think I mean, that may be that's a factor sort of in a huge factor in the loss, as well as the kind of the love and the life partner loss, but the creative partner as well.
Well, their life was the creative life also. I mean, it seemed to me that, when she writes the romantic scene about swimming in that kind of spring, wherever that was, I can't remember if that's California or Hawaii or something, that's absolutely written as a kind of romance.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's so that's the literary thing, the kind of very self-conscious literariness, which is what actually separates these books from her other work, and from even a lot of it's kind of high literary gestures that she makes, the Gawain and the Green Knight and
Yeah.
I of course love the interweaving of the Episcopal, there aren't that many writers who are also Episcopalian. I mean, I don't no longer go to church, and I think she was still going to church, but it it's sort of like an amazing thing to see that sensibility, um, at work, and it's kind of moving to me, how important the Cathedral of St. John the Divine was, and how faith seems to actually be an element in her life, which I wouldn't have imagined, before
Yeah,
this.
I mean, no, I think in if nothing else, I mean, I think faith as a kind of a narrative, or there are all of those narrative pillars. I think about the beginning, or that I think about the essay "Slouching Towards Bethlehem" again, where she talks about the lack of a common narrative, that this is, people had forgotten. There's that one scene where a kid is going to hitchhike from San Francisco to New York, and she says, "I can get you a ride to Chicago," and he says, "I'm not going to Chicago. I'm going to New York," and he has absolutely no idea of even the geographic narrative of North America. So that loss of, like, I think she's holding on to these narrative pillars. So Max is back.
Yeah, are you okay if we go to some audience questions now?
Yeah, let's go to some
Sure.
audience.
Because there's a lot of questions, so I thought we could. That was really interesting. I hate to cut it off, but I think it will continue. So I've grouped them a little bit. So this is the first one is kind of a big question about really about language and grief, I would say. Or Christine Robb of Islesboro, Maine says, "In profound grief, I have found that it's terribly hard to find words to express it, and equally difficult to find words for those who are recently bereaved. For professional writers, this absence of words must feel like an amputation." And another questioner, Claudia Valentino, says, "I wonder if either of you have any thoughts or responses to the fact that she had to put her own art form, writing, in service to her own grief. There's something so cruel, not wrong, but cruel about that setup. And yet she managed to do it rather than go silent." And I asked that first because, and I'm thinking of this quote from Didion in the book. She says, "Nor can we know ahead of the fact, and here lies the heart of the difference between grief as we imagine it and grief as it is, the unending absence that follows, the void, the very opposite of meaning, the relentless succession of moments during which we will confront the experience of meaninglessness itself." So there's this thing about, there's a problem for language in two senses, like on the one hand, grief completely unmoors you and changes you both internally and externally. And that's one thing. The other thing is you're confronted with this, as she puts it, total sense of meaninglessness, the impossible to find language. It's impossible to find language at all. So I guess my question is, or the question sort of is, is there some sense in which language feels like a betrayal or a distraction from the real thing, which is the confrontation with meaninglessness and silence as the only possible response, and anything other than that is inauthentic in some way. But the other part of it is, in some ways that unmooring could be, and this is going to sound cold, that unmooring could be useful to a writer. The defamiliarizing of the world could be helpful to a writer. So I guess my question is, in all of these questions, I mean, when you think about grief and writing, is it in fact useful to you as a writer, or is it this emptiness that you have to work through? And I guess in answering that question, you could either refer to Didion or you could refer to your own writing.
Well, David, is it okay if I go first?
Please, yeah.
I have always found that writing is the great healer of grief. I mean, it's the thing that Peter Sachs says in the English essay, that you're replacing the person who's gone. You get to spend time with the person who's gone. There's the shock, but then as you start to remember, they come back. I mean, she says, "I want him back," but she also somewhere says that she feels consoled by writing. So I've always felt, lucky me, I'm a writer. I don't have to, I have a way to deal with grief. so that's sort of what I always write out of it. I just go right to the poem I go right to the keyboard or the notebook and I may not have language at first. So I describe the lampshade. I say to my students, well, just describe the lampshade, and then you're going, and then you're in that sort of, just to use her river, you're in that experience, as you were talking about in the chemo room with your mother, that you were like wanting to make note of those posts, those buoys uh, in the experience you were going through.
And I agree with that entirely. I mean, for me, it's, how would I put it? I mean, certainly in the work I'm doing now, some of which predates the death, right? So there's
Mhm.
grief or grieving over the living person who is going to die at some point that we don't know when that is. But for me, it's partly, and I don't really believe in writing as therapeutic exactly, but there is a kind of consoling aspect to it in the sense that it keeps me present in the moment in a certain sense. It keeps me writing about what I'm going through and what I'm feeling. And it's not that I'm going to come to some resolution, because I haven't, and I don't expect to necessarily. But there's something about recording those moments, those individual circumstances, that the quality of the loss. I think for me, it actually pushes me farther, and maybe towards more ruthlessness in terms of exposure. Let's say exposing my own emotional. My own grief and my own the emotional complications of it, because I want to try and understand it, but I also want to try and do justice to it, if that makes sense. I want to be
Mhm.
scrupulously non-sentimental. I want to be aware of it in all of its contradictions and conundrums, and its positivity and negativity. When my mother was dying, a lot of the material I wrote about was about the idea that while I knew she was dying, she was still alive, and that she
Right.
was alive and participating in life in whatever way she could during those days. And so I didn't want to, and I was very struck by that, by the sense of a kind of continuity, or I think at one point, the veil gets very thin in some way. And
Right.
so I
Right.
be able to explore that, and language gives me a way to explore that, or it makes me have to sit down and be rigorous about it.
Yeah. Well, let's that's really interesting and well said. Let's go back to Didion for a second. I mean, on the same vein, Robin Pashby writes, "I'm a psychologist, and I hear trauma in her writings on grief, as I hear
Mhm.
in my patients, since grief and trauma are so intersecting. It's often the case that patients in trauma are reporters of their experiences rather than feelers of it." And
Mm.
rhyming with that comment, Jordan Smith from Clifton Park, New York writes, "Part of Didion's practice as a writer was the precise presentation of specifics at the same time that she suggested that significance was somewhere else, and that the writerly attention she gave to small incongruities was a defense against the gathering anxiety at the understanding that things won't cohere." Which, of course, will remind you of all of Didion, of course, but specifically in
Yeah.
this case, it reminds you of her studying of scientific tracts in Year of Magical Thinking. Like she's not going to read poetry. She's going to read, scientific
Right.
papers. Um, so, how, I mean, what's your response to that? I mean, is that, I mean, is that a technique, a literary technique? Is it a practice, as, Honor was talking about, Didion the journalist, or do you hear it as a symptom? In the way that these commentators are suggesting.
You mean that the writing? Go ahead, David. Sorry.
No, no, go ahead.
Go.
Okay.
No,
What I was going to say was, I agree. I mean, we hear trauma in the. I mean, this is. I think that certainly Year of Magical Thinking, Blue Nights, I think, is a little bit different because it's written at more of a chronological remove, and also, as we were talking about in the conversation, I don't think she gets to the. I think she's so traumatized she can't cut through it in the writing as much as she does in Magical Thinking. But Magical Thinking, which is written sort of in the immediate aftermath or in the moment after, it is to me an attempt to deal with that trauma in using the
right.
tools the only tools she has. And and what is always been attractive to me about Didion since I first read her when I was a teenager is that sense of, of meaninglessness, or that what do we do? How do we reckon with the inherent meaninglessness of everything, right? We tell ourselves stories in order to live. The second part of that, or the beginning of the second paragraph of that essay, The White Album, is, or at least we do for a while, right? And so what she's saying there is that narrative will sustain us, but only so far. It's not going to save us. It's going to allow us to kind of work through some things, but in the end, we're going to face our own dissolution and the dissolution of everybody we know, and the end of the, whatever, however far down the existential rabbit hole you want to go. And so there's a clarity to that vision for me. There always has been. And again, it may echo the fact, or it may have something to do with the fact that my own inner weather echoes her inner weather on that score. But I always felt like she was she's not looking away from those implications, and that is one of the things I find most meaningful about all of her work going back to the very beginning.
Well, it's interesting that she can, what I was going to say was, if one is disintegrated by trauma, then the act of writing, the act of art, is integrating, reintegrating. Perhaps the pieces are different, but it's an act of reintegrating. Oh God, I can't remember the last thing you said because it was going to lead me to the next thing. So it's the act of reintegrating. But it doesn't mean that reality goes away. It just means that you're changed by it,
Right.
In every way, just as you're changed by trauma. And I think that, there's that thing, that EMDR therapy. Do you know about that? Where you have the TikTok and you keep re-narrating the trauma. And as I was writing my recent book, I kept re-narrating it, and I realized that it was a form of that. Revision is a form of dealing with trauma, with that kind of EMDR process of going through the narrative, going through the narrative, until it loses a kind of fraughtness. It loses its causticness, you know.
That's such an interesting point. I think that's absolutely right. I never quite thought of revision that way, but it's true. Like for me, when I'm revising, it's so much about it's so much about existing in the language.
Right.
Once I get the draft now, and then it becomes about refining and honing the language. And there is a kind of reconciliation involved there. I think that's really fascinating.
Well, it just struck me lately. And I think it's helpful. And by the way, I hate to say therapeutic about writing. The thing I've come up with lately, I'm not entirely pleased with it, is metabolizing.
Yeah.
Let's stick with that because we have actually time for only one more question. And even though there's a lot of great questions, but we've talked about memoirs of grief from the writer's perspective mostly. And I just want to end, I guess, with a question from the reader's perspective, because there are a lot of people who are, listening who are actually grieving. They're
Mhm.
Seth, Trudy Wells Meyer from Scottsdale, Arizona says, in one word, what helps?
Mhm.
And Christy Sherrod from Bolivar, Tennessee says, what's the best way to begin writing about loss that may not be a death, but other types of loss, such as divorce? And
Mhm.
Elaine Pugh from Waltham, Mass says, when do you stop thinking about the husband you lost?
Mhm.
So I guess I want to just ask what you think. I mean, there have been a number of popular, I don't know the right word, but there have been a number of memoirs of grief in the last few years that people have turned to. Didion's is probably one of the first, maybe, but there, H is for Hawk, and there are Joyce Carol Oates, and
Mhm.
so I guess I'm curious what you think about that. I mean, what is there? Would you give a copy of one of these books, Didion's or the others, to a friend in a similar situation? You know, why do you think readers can or do or should turn to these books? What's in it for them in a way? Is there consolation in it? Is there a deeper understanding? Is there some kind of cathartic like, I'm just curious, you've thought about these things. I'm just curious what you think about that.
I think there's companionship. I think that grief and loss are very lonely, and you feel completely sort of abandoned and by yourself, and nobody else has ever felt this. And you need to be assured that you're not crazy. And so I think of it as companionship, and that's what I want I want to sort of share what, and Didion does this too, share what it felt like to be there in that place nobody knows. And I'll be there with you.
Hmm.
I'll be there with you.
That's a great way of putting it. I remember interviewing her on the tour for Year of Magical Thinking in Pasadena, and this signing was the most astonishing thing I think I'd seen at a literary event at that point, because people were coming up. She was signing for, after the event, for an hour and a half, because people were coming up not only to have their books signed but to share their grief stories. And so it's really, the sort of the role of that book is cathartic, I think, for a lot of readers, in the sense that, exactly as Honor's saying, in the sense that she was articulating something, in articulating her own grief, she was articulating something about their grief, and that there was a sense of being seen or heard or understood or in conversation. Um, I want to say, I think, I think grief is a highly individual experience, and loss is a highly individual experience, and we all deal with it in our own way. And I think it's not even one size fits all for each of us. It depends on who the person, or what, or the thing, or the what we've lost, and what we're grieving about. So in the case of, say, Oates, which I think that The Widow's Diary, that book is I think my favorite of her books, because it's so claustrophobically insular in terms of its grief, in the 6 months or so that it traces, the immediate 6 months after her husband's death. But then, she got criticized completely unjustly, I think, because about 6 months after that book came out, she remarried, and there were all these sort of snarky, there's a
A little
snarky,
longer than that.
right,
A little longer
yeah,
than that.
a little longer, right? So, whereas I feel like those two things are completely not incompatible. It's just depending on
Right.
how processes their grief. My mother-in-law, on the other hand, my father-in-law died young, almost 30 years ago. And my mother-in-law has gone on to, have her life and continue her life, but she still carries a torch, right? And she thinks about him often, and, and that's part of her grieving mechanism, or part of her experience of grieving or loss. And so I think it's individual for everyone. The power of books like this, as Honor was saying, is that they open up a conversation, or a companionship is a perfect way of putting it. It's there's a human connection with someone else who has not gone through exactly the same thing as you have, but something similar.
Yeah. And they
Thanks.
can say, I recognize you.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. I think that's the perfect place to end this wonderful conversation. You've been listening to David Ulin and Honor Moore discuss Joan Didion's memoirs and later writings. The final volume in the Library of America edition of her writings, edited by David, and available singly or in a boxed 3-volume edition. Please join us for forthcoming online events from Library of America. On Tuesday, December 17, it's LOA at the Movies, a special holiday program featuring Justin Chang, Molly Haskell, and other distinguished film critics in a lively conversation about the greatest, strangest, and most beloved movies based on works in the Library of America series.
Oh, cool.
And if you miss Adam Gopnik's online course this fall on American writers in Paris, stay tuned for an announcement about a new course slated for the spring. Details and links to register for LOA programs can be found on our website, loa.org/events, where you'll also find information about the LOA Joan Didion edition and links to purchase those and other editions of Great American Writing. LOA is made possible with support from Library of America members and viewers. We're grateful to everyone here tonight for joining us. If you're not already an LOA member, please consider joining. LOA members receive special discounts, including half-price admission to ticketed programs, invitations to exclusive events, and other benefits, while supporting Library of America's nonprofit mission. You can learn more at loa.org/membership. Thanks so much again to Honor Moore and David Ulin for a really wonderful evening, and have a great evening.